It's a very powerful archetype.
Far right, who have chosen the genre of fantasy.
It becomes very difficult to take the power back.
This week, let's talk a little bit about the right and why they love Tolkien. We've talked about how they're all into like sci-fi and fantasy, and what is it with Tolkien in particular that they're aligning to?
Well, hi Simon. Well, first of all, yeah, it's disappointing to me personally because I grew up reading Lord of the Rings myself.
Yeah.
Wouldn't describe myself as part of the far right or the alt right,
No.
but I did grow up a lot around Lord of the Rings and probably was out there pretending to be a hobbit or an elf or.
So it's just a populist move that they're trying to go for. They know it's got a very wide audience, so let's align ourselves to something that the masses enjoy, whether they've read the books or seen the films or something. Maybe people will kind of be on our side if we align ourselves to that.
No, I think it's genuine. I think they are really into it,
Okay.
and it's become such a huge thing for the right. And I mean, maybe we should just contextualize why we're talking about this. Some of the people. So Georgia Meloni is someone I think we should talk about quite a lot in this episode. She's the Prime Minister of Italy. Mm-hmm. Apparently cosplayed as a hobbit when she was younger. Used to go to these hobbit festivals, and she grew up with this very right-wing party called the Brothers of Italy, and apparently Lord of the Rings was one of their sacred texts. And then we've got the kind of penchant now for tech companies run by these kind of very right-wing figures to name their companies after items or things from the Lord of the Rings. So we got Palantir doing mass surveillance of US and other societies around the world. One of Peter Thiel's companies, and the Palantir is the seeing stone for those of you who've seen the Lord of the Rings that they could use to communicate around around Middle Earth. So that's Palantir. And then you got Anduril, which is a kind of AI arms company. So they're basically arms dealers using AI to create all these amazing new weapons. And they're run by this kind of former gamer called Palmer Luckey, the guy with a goatee beard.
This is a guy that's just sort of partnered recently with Zuckerberg as well.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. He's partnered with Zuckerberg. He sold Oculus Rift to them, so going into this theme about virtual reality and all this stuff. And now he wants to start World War III essentially, and he's not shy about it. And he wears like a palm tree shirt. He's got the goatee beard, but then he's out there essentially trying to start wars so he can sell these amazing ones. So that's Anduril. And then you've got lots of other Lord of the Rings references all the time, and I think I want to go pretty deep into it. I mean, essentially they're saying that Lord of the Rings encapsulates kind of Western values. So this idea of kind of reclaiming the values of the West. I think it's really important in this. And then another idea I think we should talk about at some point is this idea like the return of the king. So the return of kind of the order through the king.
Yeah, I think that's quite good. I mean, when they talk about in terms of like the values of the West, are they talking about the left side or the right side? I mean, it's quite kind of common knowledge that Tolkien sort of was party with the sort of kind of the Great War and stuff like that. There were several influences at the time as well, and then there was a rise of Nazism. I know that he had, when he tried to get one of his manuscripts published in Germany, he got a forthcoming letter back asking him if he was part of the Aryan race as well, as Nazism was starting to kind of grow. So, are they just cherry picking as to what they see are their values of the West as opposed to what we may believe in or what's been believed in over the last sort of 50, 60 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe right at the end we should go back to poor old J.R.R. Tolkien himself, because I think his way of looking at the world was quite a long way away from these people looking at the world, and they're definitely cherry picking, like you say. But it's deeper than that, because Tolkien is I think professor of Nordic mythology.
Yeah.
Right. Back then, and he's in part of this circle of people who are looking at kind of the Nordic, myths and the Nordic sagas. That is a very deep strand within Nazism. You know, this kind of idea of going back to this kind of ancient or mythical kind of Nordic German history somewhere that exists out there. The story of Lord of the Rings itself is a bit of a version of the whole kind of ring cycle stories in Germany. You know, with all this stuff of the dwarves and the rings and all that all comes out of German Nordic mythology, right? So he takes from that and he creates a kind of modern story and a kind of a contemporary story about that. And yeah, he had this idea of recreating Britain's mythology because he thought that Britain had lost its mythology. So he very much goes back to those kind of Nordic myths. And of course, the Nazis are really into that stuff. You know, massively into that stuff, and then you know, through the composer Wagner, who does his famous ring cycle, you know, that's probably the biggest cultural influence on the Nazis. There's others as well, like the Tula Society and all those kind of esoteric kind of myths they're into, but probably Wagner and that kind of whole repackaging of kind of German mythology is probably the biggest influence on them culturally, I would argue. So there's definitely that stuff is happening at the same time that Tolkien is developing his mythology. But I'd argue they were doing it for very different reasons and for different motives. But so let's go back to this thing, saving the West. It's pretty white. I think there's only a few bits when women say anything in Lord of the Rings. There's not many female characters. It's about the survival of the West, you know. So Numenor was this kind of island out in the West, and then it gets destroyed, and then the survivors of Westerners are kind of in Middle Earth and the Western lands, and then you've got this terrible power in the East of Sauron. So you can see how they can take some of that as a defense of the West, right? So yeah, there's definitely some common stories there, obviously between the German and Nordic myths and Tolkien's story, but then also people trying to take that and turn it into some kind of defense of the West, the white race, cultural values. Yeah, I can see why it works for them. Put it this way.
Right. Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. I mean, one of the things you mentioned was about the kind of, you know, the return of the king and sort of getting into that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very powerful archetype. You know, this idea that somebody comes along who is kind of powerful, good, and who somehow kind of restores the natural order of things. So the natural order is being kind of torn apart, right? Whether that's Sauron, the kind of decadence, the fragmentation of the kind of Western kingdoms. Arnor is destroyed, and then Gondor is kind of semi, you know, a bit decadent. It's run by the stewards. The line of the kings has run out, and it's getting weaker. People's lifespans are getting shorter in the book, right? And then Aragorn, who's the king who comes back eventually, comes from this noble line from Numenor. He's got a bigger lifespan. They've kept the blood pure, right? I mean, he's the actual, you know, he's the heir coming all the way down. So, you know, the bloodline is there, and that encapsulates something, you know, very kind of sacred, important. And he's able eventually to reforge the sword and come back and restore order, you know, into Middle Earth, defeat Sauron, and kind of restore, you know, the kind of, you know, the kind of more, you know, kind of wholesome, united society where everything's in its natural place. And I think that idea is really important. And it's, you know, I sometimes think about the monarchy a lot, and the monarchy on the one hand is a ridiculous idea.
The monarchy specifically in the UK, or the monarchy anywhere?
In general, the idea that there's a kind of divine right, and that some people are just more suited to rule because of a kind of bloodline, and that they are kind of ordained in some way just through the natural order or through God, and that they, you know, kind of need to rule in some way. And on one level, it's kind of ridiculous. It's very incompatible with our modern ideas around society and democracy and biology and, you know, nurture versus nature and all these kind of things. But on the other hand, how many countries have still got monarchies? And how many people, like, even if they're kind of Democrats, they still think, oh, yeah, we still love the king, or, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a very powerful idea.
It is. I mean, the whole monarchy thing is quite interesting. I'm not a royalist by any means, and obviously, you know, it's from the outside looking, it's overall like quite a large firm, so to kind of speak. But there's also this kind of idea that we have this democracy, especially in the UK, which is working, and that the king himself has no political influence, which we've seen from past letters that have gone out from that there is political influence. He meets once a week with the Prime Minister. So there is this, and they still have certain powers, which are more or less ceremonial, but if they try to bring those into force, they dissolve Parliament, declare war, all these kind of things. Those things are still kind of in the midst. I wonder in terms of like, with the return of the king for the far right, so to speak, I mean, she should be dominant return of the queen really, but it's whether you have like all these far right groups, are they connected with under that kind of one vision, or as we just seen this as a kind of European aspect?
Well, I think there's kind of two sort of versions of it. One is the aristocratic version around the king, and the other is around the leader, and I think they're related, and I think both of them tap into a very deep kind of archetype and also fill a kind of void in people to kind of have somebody responsible, and it's the father figure, and that father figure is very powerful in psychology. It's kind of it's a safety thing. It's somebody who kind of is going to solve the problems. He's a source of powerful, unquestioned authority. I think it's really powerful for people, especially in times when society is lacking direction and lacking confidence, and people are kind of looking for somebody to come and save them. You can see that in so many places, and it can take many, many different guises. I mean, I spent a lot of time when I was growing up in Argentina, and they had this guy called Juan Domingo Perón. I mean, really not great in terms of his record, but quite beloved at many times in Argentine history as this kind of father figure, right? As this guy who kind of is just unquestionable and has kind of done everything. And you can see sort of versions of that in so many different societies. And sometimes they're monarchs, sometimes they're just powerful figures and patriarchs. And I think that's quite challenging for democratic thought, because it's not necessarily what people want to hear, but it's a very, just observing it in society, it's a very powerful thing. And even Trump, there's a kind of element, I've seen all this paraphernalia and the merchandise around Trump, and some of it's actually quite weird. Like, Trump on these kind of big flags, and it kind of says like "Daddy's home" and this kind of very, very kind of weird sort of stuff. But there's something to that, right? There's this idea that somebody's going to come along and solve all the problems. There's always some kind of charismatic figure, or somebody knows something that other people don't know. And then, at its extreme, you get this whole thing of the leadership principle in Germany and Nazism, where they create this whole idea of the leadership principle, where the Führer must not be cannot be questioned, must not be questioned. The whole idea is that you have this leader who is somehow spiritually in touch with the people, and who doesn't need to go through a kind of rational contract. They just know it's spiritual. And Perón had that in Argentina. His whole thing with the masses was have these huge rallies where they would kind of shout things out and he would respond. And obviously Mussolini turned that into a kind of system, this idea of the leader, and then Hitler ran with that, this whole thing. So this idea that somebody is just somehow unique and uniquely qualified to run society, and that means then you don't need to worry about it.
I suppose the masses do want leadership because there's less thought or less thinking for them, as long as they get the life that they want. But it's like you mentioned a lot of names there, some perceived as good, some perceived as bad, and it brings us to that analogy of sort of like good dads, bad dads, and we've got Trump doing his thing at the moment. We're saying people want to find this kind of leadership, and maybe it's like leading people like the Proud Boys and the rest of the kind of nation. People will define that as a bad dad, or in terms of the people who are outside of that, his echo chamber. I mean, do you think that with somebody having, again, the whole kind of king or that divinity thing, or whether it's a CEO acting as a point of a king, or the far right being able to impose something which is similar to a king, at which point does that then become, that person have the ability to become a bad dad or a good dad? What do you need to put into place to stop this kind of thing from happening?
Yeah, well, I guess once you trust them as the daddy, you have to have a high degree of trust, and it can go either way. It's within history, it's an incredible, powerful thing, right? And it's there because also, I think, as you said, we need leaders, right? Some people are more willing to take a lead than other people, and leadership in itself is not a bad thing. The fact that certain people are able to put their heads above the parapet, who are prepared to take more risk, who are prepared to go out there and put themselves out there more. That's not a bad thing. But I would argue the idea of somehow suspending belief and handing your autonomy and your trust entirely to another person is probably not a good idea.
No,
right?
but I imagine it's, from an innate human point of view, it allows you to have someone to blame when things go wrong. Which as humans we tend not to sort of blame ourselves first. We try to look for figures that we can do that. If there's one person who's in control trying to manage hundreds of millions of people and kind of get it wrong, which they're not always going to get right, and I'm not sympathising at all with Trump or any other leaders like that. But, it comes to a point where you just want to be able to kind of live your life and make sure that someone else is kind of running that system. So you're prepared to go with whatever madness they dictate, whether that's a president or a CEO, president of a company, saying some of the most bizarre things as we've seen them say on their own sort of kind of platforms, and just be allowed to get away with it,
Yeah, and also generally speaking, these people are not shy about taking more power. So then it becomes very difficult to take the power back. Right, so generally these people want to accumulate power for themselves. Most of them, it doesn't end well, precisely because it actually doesn't end up with them just having the blame put on them and then being voted out because they can't be voted out, and it can end up in this very kind of Wagnerian, right, to go back to Wagner, kind of outcome of like everything, the world going up in flames and the people going down with the leader, right? And that's a very strong trend within society. You have to, once you've identified with the leader, your fate is tied to the leader in many ways. So I think the Lord of the Rings encapsulates a lot of this, but in quite in a good way. I mean, Aragorn is not evil. He's there. He's not there for power. He's there because he wants to be a steward, right? He's a healer in the book, right? So he finds this kind of way. He recovers this lost knowledge of how to heal people through the herbs that he finds, or the flower that he finds that he can heal people with. His hands are healing. He fights evil. So I'm not saying it always has, I'm not saying it has to be a negative archetype, but I guess at this stage, what I'm saying, it is a very powerful archetype. This idea of the return of the king, the idea that the world is broken and that somebody's going to come along. It's a standard narrative in films and books and. And that taps into something. So the right, has taken this, and then so I think there's that element of it, and it's also the medieval trappings. It harks back to a simpler, earlier world, at least for people in the West, but also actually, funnily enough, for many people not in the West as well. They're able to identify with it, and this kind of a simpler, earlier society, and then it's also mixed with the fairy tales. And again, the fairy tales are there because they tap into very powerful historical memory and collective unconscious and archetypes as well, right?
Well, it's quite interesting in terms of this, medievalism, or this neo-medievalism that you're kind of talking about, which is what they're sort of trying to attach to, this fantasy kind of world. And then you have a lot of the generation coming forward now trying to sort of detach themselves from the technological world and going back to more kind of bespoke sort of things, handmade things, stuff like that. And it seems like more than a coincidence, as you say, that a lot of these big companies are naming themselves after sort of medieval things or things which are fantastical, something that relates to that world. So, if you're part of that collective, you don't necessarily feel like you're part of this sort of digital world. I wonder if there's a little bit of kind of manipulation in those parts as well on the technological side.
I think there is, right? And it's interesting. It's role playing, and being able to role play within the kind of modern world, right, and even the digital world, but then to kind of be able to return to more of a kind of fantasy world, and this kind of fantastic world of simpler, freer, but also simpler binary choices between good and evil. So going out and killing monsters and fighting orcs and being able to do that in a way which is absolutely good and absolutely morally good. So there's not all the kind of nuance, right? I mean, Sauron represents absolute evil, and his creatures, many of them are kind of just kind of ciphers for evil. Orcs and trolls and people. They're not people you need to even think twice about killing, right? Because you are doing the right thing by doing it.
I think the problem that the right probably has with this is they've taken what Tolkien's interpretation is of speciesism from orcs and trolls and things like that, and they've adopted it to. I mean, some people talk online about how there were stereotypes applied to the orcs to be of a certain race, whether those are people of colour or the black tongue and things like that. And then some people say, well, you know, they would even talk about. Go off and talk about J.K. Rowling, for example, and talk about how the bankers were of a particular type, which lived up sort of certain stereotypes in our kind of modern world. And it seems like the right are kind of using that speciesism and turning something into racism, which is, I mean, race, as we know, is a social construct anyway. It doesn't kind of really exist. But the narrative of the way certain creatures look or behave, and they're always kind of depicted as the savages or, you know, this kind of stuff. It's quite interesting to me. The other thing I'll say is obviously we know that the Lord of the Rings has such a massive, wide fan base, you know, globally, you know, and it's kind of, as a result of these books, it's kind of led on to the fantasy genre just exploding in its own right. And you know, from Game of Thrones, which goes back to harking that kind of medieval kind of thing. I was wondering in terms of like if you're aware of the kind of opposition that, you know, the far right may be getting from like the general fans of like the Tolkienists, so to speak, who feel that this whole kind of thing is being adapted in completely the wrong and negative way. I mean, is there a big pushback on that, do you think, or?
Yeah, and I think, you know, 90% of Tolkien fans, they're not even thinking about things in those terms at all.
It's just a good story.
It's just a great story, and I think a lot of it touches quite noble sentiments, you know, in people, and it's not about going out there and fighting a culture war.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that. Interesting with the very disastrous corporate takeover of parts of the Lord of the Rings real estate by Jeff Bezos in the Rings of Power, which I think was a disastrous series. But it's quite interesting. I mean, a lot of the controversy was because he had black elves and people. For most people, it made no difference. It worked actually fine, and who cares? It's just like, and then for the kind of, you know, the few out there fighting the culture war, they were kind of like, oh, how can you be putting black people in? Yeah, and everyone else is just like, oh, what absolute difference does it make? You know,
Yeah,
no one
it's
cares.
just
No one cares.
wokeism at its finest, really.
Yeah,
and that
right
kind of-
wokeism at its finest. No one, you know, no one cares either way. But yeah, very interesting. So I'd say most people, you know, Lord of the Rings fans, not into obviously the far right stuff, probably don't even know about it.
Yeah, I was going to say the awareness level's probably quite low on that, I'd imagine, from their part, because, you know, it's a fight for kind of good.
Yeah, and it's a childhood thing, and it's something you can keep going back to. And like you said, it's interesting because it's the basis probably for 90% of the fantasy kind of architecture and imaginary architecture, right?
Yeah.
You know, Tolkien, in a way, he sets, you know, the whole thing with, you know, the elves and the dwarves and the trolls and the knights. I mean, a lot of what you see is somehow based on Tolkien in some way, and it's a fantastic imaginative achievement. I think so. Yeah, so most people don't care, but I'd still argue it's really important. And this kind of clash of narratives over it, and their kind of attempt to, you know, the far right's kind of idea of kind of taking this narrative and turning it into a kind of social, political narrative is quite a dangerous thing. The Nazis were actually able to do it really successfully with German kind of archetypes and with, you know, some genuine German mythology and a lot of made up genuine. So they were able to.
Because it's there already, so it's just a foundation to build upon, really, isn't it?
Yeah, they created a whole bunch of stuff. There's a very kind of famous book called The Occult. I think we have it here somewhere. It's called The Occult Roots of Nazism, and it's written by an English academic and very classic book. It was written about 30, 40 years ago. And in it, we'll put the details up. He basically talks about how there was all these kind of folkish societies around Germany and Munich in the kind of 1920s who were into kind of uncovering these kind of runes and kind of this German past that in fact didn't even exist. And it was all these kind of, you know, knowledge, you know, these kind of masters of knowledge and these secret runes and secret spots, and it was kind of RPG. Created this kind of RPG. And then they started kind of they created this thing called the Tula Society that had this whole origin myth of like the Aryan race, and then they had all the kind of symbols they got. They appropriated the reverse swastika and all these kind of symbols from like runes and stuff. And then, it went horrible. It went dark, right? Like really dark for humanity, right? And they end up having like an SS castle where they got all these kind of like sacred kind of paraphernalia, sort of stuff you could get on Etsy probably these days. And then you kind of, trying to recreate all these rituals and stuff, but then combined with, technology of war and everything. So trapping people in your narrative can be a very dangerous thing. And there was definitely a kind of a move from the kind of romantics of German history and Romanticism, and the idea of reclaiming German nationalism and culture. Because don't forget, Germany wasn't there as a nation; it was a kind of fragmented patchwork of many different polities. And this idea of kind of creating the German nation and language, and the Nazis were able to really run with that. I don't think that's going to happen with Lord of the Rings, but again, it's really interesting that they've tried to appropriate certain values and kind of say those are the Western values, and that somehow that's our narrative.
Well, I find it quite comical in terms of the appropriation of different genres. So we were just talking about the tech guys, and they're appropriating all the kind of sci-fi stuff, all those works of fiction to build their foundations off of, and then you've got the far right who've chosen the genre of fantasy. So they're kind of almost in direct contrast, but you can probably see some overlaps that could kind of occur in that kind of.
No, for sure. You remember on one of the other last podcasts we talked about this whole thing about dark MAGA, and there's all these pictures of like Elon Musk out there, kind of dressed as like a Roman. We should talk about ancient Rome at some point as well.
Yeah,
there's this whole thing about tech people thinking about Rome all the time. Elon Musk is out there, kind of dressed as a gladiator. Kind of it's us versus them. I'm the only person who can save humanity. There's definitely this kind of attempt to appropriate the archetypes of kind of leadership and strength and savior complex, right? And then with the ability to produce endless AI slop at the touch of a button, you're able to kind of try and tap into those archetypes, and all the far right groups try and tap into kind of older archetypes in some way.
Now maybe it's because familiarity makes us more comfortable. So in terms of like you think sort of like how we're educated in the West and what we're educated on from things like the Roman Empire and things like that, and we see these kind of figures that they're used to, and you're told that these are very powerful men or very powerful women in their own right. And you see somebody actually replicating that visually in front of you. It's almost like a nostalgic thing. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, I know that kind of must be that's going to be good for us. That's going to bring back some sort of form of empire, but for good, because we're going to learn from our mistakes, which we never do. But so whether you've got Zuckerberg out there with his sort of like Roman haircut and wrestling on the ground. I mean, I'm sure he'll start doing toga parties next. But
I think he's already done the toga parties when he was younger.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting that I think that they're tapping back into these sort of kind of figures of power.
Yeah, well, this is it, and I think it's really interesting that, I mean, maybe just leave the Lord of the Rings for a sec. Although the Lord of the Rings, in a way, is kind of the, one of the most powerful kind of narratives out there that you can try and appropriate, right? So there's definitely that going on. But this Rome thing is really interesting. I mean, if you look at, all the political scientists can only discuss what's going on in the US now by comparing it to that period in Roman history where the Republic gets overthrown. So, crossing the Rubicon, all those kind of ideas, it's constantly what people are talking about is, US, decadence and kind of getting to the point where the Republic is overthrown and is Trump that person who's going to do it, right? And it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Then there's a kind of narrative around kind of decadence, that the US is decadent and society doesn't work anymore, and that's tied up with ideas of kind of sexual, changing sexual boundaries and gender boundaries, the idea of a kind of elite that doesn't care about the masses and out of touch, right? So there's all these kind of parallels being made with the Roman Empire, and then you've got Zuckerberg doing his thing, like with his haircut and his Latin slogans on his t-shirts, and then he wants to become a gladiator, right? So and then Trump, probably one of the only places where he still gets cheered massively at the moment is when he shows up at UFC, and UFC is gladiators, right? It's really brutal, and it's just pure bread and circuses of watching people beat each other for entertainment, right? It's incredibly barbaric. I'm sorry. And I mean, I'd say this, I can see you smiling, Simon, because I'm someone who's done martial arts and combat sports myself, but it's incredibly brutal. And it's just for entertainment, people beating themselves senseless with baying crowds. And the older I get and the more I look at it, the more I see it as something just sick, to be honest. Facebook now has Dana White on their board, right? So there's this whole signaling that somehow we need more kind of martial virtues. And again, that was something that kind of happened in the Roman Empire. And when the kind of key figures of the Civil War started emerging, it was really about kind of brutal signaling in many cases. And it's about war, and it's about preparing the population for war. And perhaps, and this does go back to the Lord of the Rings, it's almost like preparing the population for a simpler, earlier set of stereotypes and patterns of behavior that go back to more older forms of behavior. So what I mean by that is the values of war are older virtues. And some of that is to do with gender. Some of that, I would argue, is about putting women more into traditional roles. Because the war is mainly still, I would argue the war is still mainly going to be about men. And it's going to be about warriors and going back to older values that are not constrained by the kind of modern society and democracy. It's the age of the warrior. That's what they're all into, a lot of these people, right?
I think it's sort of like, you're talking about sort of how they're sort of pushing this premise as well, coming back with like the trad wives and all these kind of things, and that coming back more into the remit. It's quite interesting in terms of all these groups associated with tribalism who are sort of on the rise because there's so much noise that's being made, and you have a whole sector who have been fighting for their own rights, whether gender rights or whatever it may be, for God knows how many hundreds of years now, kind of getting dulled and settled under this cacophony of noise that's coming from the social media and these kind of aspects. And the Trump thing's quing interesting with the whole UFC thing, because obviously, as we know, he was heavily involved in like WWE back in the day and all that kind of stuff, and we know who he has in the White House now as a kind of result of that. So that alignment now to the UFC, which is like that one step further, of entertainment and this kind of war, this kind of gladiator type thing, or this kind of Sparta type thing that all these kind of people are bringing into. It seems to work for the masses.
Yeah, and I mean, as you said, the people he's got around him. I mean, Pete Hegseth, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's a classic one, right? The guy who at the moment is Secretary of Defense. I'm not sure how long he'll last. He seems to be a very unstable character. But I mean, he's got like the Christian kind of crusader tattoos, and apparently he's got like anti-Islam tattoos and stuff. Okay. He's got a big drinking habit apparently, and he's he wants war fighting, right? He's a former
nice guy.
Yeah, he's a former Fox News kind of guy who's just into the he's all about the war fighting and the lethality, as he calls it, right? So there's that kind of return to it's okay to be into these earlier, more barbaric kind of values around it. It's okay to kill people essentially. And again, go back to the Lord of the Rings. It's about creating. There is a thing about binaries, right? It's not the most subtle thing about who's good and bad. There's only probably one subtlety, which is around Saruman and whether he deserves to be killed or not, or forgiven, or let to go in his own way. Other than that, you got to kill the bad guys, right? And there's no real kind of questioning around that, because they are evil. They're not just making a wrong choice. They're evil, and they're going to kill you. So I think that kind of getting to that simpler world of kind of good and evil, I think that's why they like the Lord of the Rings. It's not that nuanced.
Well, again, it's that whole idea of history is written by the hand of the victor, and if you kind of look at this in the narrative of where it's painted, this is overarching like the Hobbit's view of kind of what's happening in this place and in this kind of time. They eventually are the ones who come out on top, but there's always, as you say, it's very hard to differentiate between the good and evil, as everyone's got another side to their kind of story. I wonder who Trump would be, in this book, or who Zuckerberg would play.
Well, for their supporters, I mean, Trump is the God Emperor who kind of comes along to bring strength and peace, right? For many of the rest of us, he's evil, right? But I mean, it's I think that it's the element of being able to have very kind of binary good versus evil and associate yourself with good, and I think it's the element of trying to take parts of the Lord of the Rings and say that somehow it's associated with the West and with kind of earlier conservative values. And again, we'll come back to this right at the end, right? But it's this idea of kind of, going back to earlier kind of noble, and then it's, mysticism and fairy tales, which again, I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's about kind of bringing people into a narrative of fantasy. Again, we've talked about a lot. There's a lot of fantasy involved in the world that the tech barons and the right is creating as well. I just want to give a shout out to a podcast actually by a guy called Damien Walter, who runs the science fiction podcast. He did a podcast on this very question, I think about 2 years ago, and he starts off with this. It's an audio podcast. He starts off with this really kind of great idea of a Britain that's been defeated in the First World War, and then these people kind of marching around with these kind of fascist symbols,
right?
And it's basically the Lord of the Rings, and that's their kind of what's informing them and motivating. It's all based around sort of Lord of the Rings symbols, but it's fascism essentially, and it's Britain kind of reasserting imperial war and dominance because they kind of feel hard done by and kind of reasserting the West. But it's quite interesting because Damon Walter, he starts off with that as his fantasy of kind of this fascist fantasy. But then he argues really strongly, actually, J.R.R. Tolkien would not have been into that at all. And that's where I think some of the interesting elements of the Lord of the Rings, the more democratic elements, come into it. So, the hobbits, right? They're the little people. The Shire is kind of an idealized part of rural England where it just, things just work in a civilized way. People work together. It's not kind of some huge empire. It's a little kind of county, basically, kind of in the countryside.
The Shires.
It's the little people who get chosen for the mission, to take the ring to Mordor and destroy it because they're uncorruptible. And whereas the kings and the great warriors are all going to be corrupted by power. And there's quite a few bits where some of the big characters could have taken the ring. Gandalf, Aragorn, Boromir tries to take the ring. And they know, the wise characters, Gandalf and Aragorn, know that if they try and take it, it will end up in disaster and dictatorship, essentially. So there's this whole kind of narrative in Tolkien about the little people, and also just standing up for like normal stuff, like eating and going to the pub and having a tankard of ale, or growing some vegetables and having a vegetable contest, and I think that's really powerful in Tolkien as well. And Tolkien had been through the First World War, and he'd seen what the machine of kind of industrial destruction could do, of throwing millions of people against each other with modern weapons, and he really reacted against that. And he I think he saw evil essentially also in environmental terms. He saw it as destroying and polluting and creating these kind of huge impersonal machines that enslave people in some way. I think that comes across quite. Don't forget, I mean, he lived through the period of fascism and then Stalinism, the Soviet Union, and I think his idea was actually, the smallness of Britain and the kind of hobbies and not the big ideas as well, right?
Yeah, because the stories show, that they pinpoint the enslavement of the hobbits as well, parts as well. And it's quite interesting you talk about sort of, what J.R.R. Tolkien's views would have been this, or what he would have said. I wonder if the estate has actually come back and said anything with the association of the book and the far right now, or whether they're just like, this is too fringe at the moment, we'll deal with it when we need to kind of deal with it, because nobody's sort of questioning us about it.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the children who are still running the estate have said, but I don't think they need to say anything either, really. I really don't. I think it's I think people will find their own truth in the book. I think it's true probably, I also don't think Tolkien was Orwell either. I don't think that's what he was about. And his view is conservative in the sense with a small c, because it's about preserving the past. And he was a professor of Nordic mythology and languages, and he invented a whole. He spent years and years inventing Elvish languages. And,
which you wouldn't be able to do today with a publisher.
Which you wouldn't be able to do, right? Yeah. And that's the stuff he was into, and it was about creating this fancy world. So I don't think Tolkien was someone who would have been in politics or anything like that. He's almost the antithesis of that. But one thing I do think is really powerful is that he had the sense that Britain had lost its myths, and he was very explicit about that. He thought that with the Industrial Revolution, people being forced off the land into factories, modernity, that in a way Britain didn't have any myths anymore. And he thought it was really important for Britain to have a myth. And that's what he wrote. And he wrote Lord of the Rings, and I don't think it's a bad myth in that sense, because it's not about power and conquest in that sense. What comes across most strongly in the books, in the films, is it's the little people. It's Sam and Frodo.
It's just the play for the underdog, isn't it? It's that kind of fight back,
Yeah, and it's a million miles away from what these people would want, culture wars and demonizing, immigrants as being the East, or, forming horrible AI weapon systems, and then calling them, Anduril, the hammer, and I think those are essentially, they are kind of fascist ideas, and they're about appropriating fairy tales for fascism. And then maybe just one last thought before we conclude. I mean, I think symbols and fairy tales are really powerful, and we neglect them at our peril. And I think this is part of the thing. The left, historically, because it was about rationalism essentially, and it was about the Enlightenment and rationalism, they kind of left that whole realm of mythology and fairy tales to the right. And it was a mistake. I mean, it's actually really important to connect with kind of older versions of ourselves, of society, of kind of deep myths. I mean, Jung talks about this a lot. Jung, the famous psychologist, he says in his reflections on modern society, there's an essay called Wotan, and it's about Hitler, and he essentially says that Hitler and the Nazis kind of very powerfully connected with this kind of Wotan spirit, which was this kind of wilder, kind of German god. Wotan is Odin, same Odin that's in the Scandinavian gods, right? Very powerful, patriarchal warrior figure who's able to cross worlds and mysticism. And he says that the Nazis were able to sort of, in that period of kind of uncertainty and defeat and mass unemployment and hunger, they were able to kind of channel this kind of very kind of strong archetype of Wotan, of this kind of more kind of kind of savage, kind of powerful archetype in a really effective way. And I think we need to really be conscious of that stuff.
It was their kind of make Germany great again, wasn't it? That was their kind of underlying thinking.
It was, but it's interesting that they were able to go back to the pseudo history. So I mean, this whole thing again, going back to the occult roots of Nazism and thing. I mean, it was like a whole backdrop of kind of mysticism, of astrologers and people into kind of esoteric ideas. People were very insecure, and so they were kind of going to all these kind of very kind of what would be now like New Age ideas. I mean, Hitler was New Age, right? Very New Age. Vegetarian, New Age. Hitler was New Age. He was into all kinds of kind of theories and mysticism and crystals, and I saw a lot of that after the pandemic, after COVID, in our societies. People just looking for conspiracy theories, looking for kind of more kind of mysticism. A lot of it's to do with healing and health, and it was a really rich background on which the Nazis could reconstruct this mythical version of German history. It never existed. It was never, none of it existed. But they created this very powerful system of archetypes and symbols, and then were able to kind of bring people together around those ideas and those symbols. And I think the left, cannot be just this modernist, cerebral layer of society. It needs to really connect with people on lots of different levels, deeper levels. And I do think some of this is pretty deep, and it's not necessarily bad. So, yeah.
So I mean, the films are good, but the books are always better. So I think just make sure you delve into those as well. But just on the last note, it's kind of like when we talk about sort of kind of like what Hitler was doing and what his kind of grand vision is, we see this whole era of eugenics now sort of trying to make its way into our culture again now as well, to sort of get rid of what they think are the to raise IQs, to make the better quality races, whatever those things may be. So it seems like these ideas never really die; they're just kind of planted somewhere else.
Yeah, actually, shout out to Dr. Nafis Ahmed, who's written this book called The Alt-Right. And it actually I was quite shocked by it, because he essentially just shows that after the Second World War, a lot of these people, a lot of the Nazi ideas kind of went into hiding a little bit, and then they kind of just resurfaced through these US think tanks.
Yeah, well, some of
And
it's
then-
still quite public in terms of the figures that they had, sort of going all through the kind of White House, who were quite openly there. Operation Paperclip, I think it was, when they took a lot of the Nazis, Russia and the Americans took a lot of them to power their way to space. But a lot of those guys remained in the White House, and there was a lot of lobbying going on and a lot of other stuff going on. So
some ideas, they take time to die. Eugenics, blood and honor, rockets to Mars. It's all still with us, just in new guises. And I think, one of the things I want to try and do on this podcast as we go along is kind of surface these ideas, and kind of just get people to see where they've come from and what it's about, and some of the other kind of trends and the genesis of some of these ideas, because it's really important for people to wake up and think, okay, what are the buttons they're really pushing with this? And again, it's not about being totally closed-minded or just immediately accusing anyone who's looking at these ideas of being a fascist or anything like that. I don't think it's about that at all. It's about understanding where different people are coming from and why people are pushing different ideas. And like I said, I mean, you can have millions of people who get great inspiration from the Lord of the Rings, and then you can have Georgia Meloni, who's the kind of super fan, who's been to New Zealand and held a big conference on the anniversary of Tolkien's death in Rome, and is super into it, and apparently dressed up as a hobbit, cosplayed many times as a hobbit, but essentially using this for ends which are kind of anti-democratic and racist. So one of the things that happened was the Ministry of Culture in Italy held this exhibition in Rome 50 years after the death of Tolkien. They spent about 250,000 euros on it. And it was Meloni's idea. It's a bit strange. I mean, it's Italy as well. It's not like Tolkien was from Italy. And the culture minister is a guy called Gennaro San Giuliano, and he announced it to the youth wing of Meloni's party as a gift. And this party, Brothers of Italy, had been organising apparently these Hobbit camp festivals, right from the 1970s. So the far right had been running these Hobbit camps for quite a while. And then when Meloni won the election, her sister Ariana went on Facebook and said that she was going to be Samwise Gamgee and accompany her sister Meloni to Mount Doom to fight evil. And then
just to be clear, that's not Ariana Grande.
No. Okay. And then this guy San Giuliano, the culture minister, I mean, he described Tolkien as a Catholic, authentic and sincere conservative, all this stuff. So essentially tried to paint Tolkien as this kind of really conservative figure. And then he said that Tolkien stood for the traditional values that have been forgotten by the West, which he described as the sense of community, nature, tradition, opposition to the most dehumanizing, controversial aspects of modernity, self-sacrifice, friendship, courage, and honor. And I want to hope in a future episode we can look at this idea of cosplay and of kind of dressing up.
We should dress up for that one, I think.
I think we should dress up, and I've got this whole concept which I'm not sure if I've seen it somewhere or I've coined it myself, but it's this idea of dark cosplay.
Okay.
Because we've had cosplay for quite a long time. We've had RPGs. I've played Dungeons and Dragons, by the way.
So tell me about dark cosplay.
A little
bit.
It's really the idea of politicians doing cosplay, right, for political ends. So you dress up as like a rescue worker or a policeman, or a fighter pilot. Putin's done that. George Bush did it.
Yeah.
Now we've got the head of Homeland Security. Christine Noemi, who goes out in like full camo, full camo gear with a rifle pointing the wrong way, pursuing, chasing immigrants around and intimidating immigrants, and I would call that dark cosplay, because cosplay is just dressing up, and there's a big trend in society for people to dress up again. I think because the current reality is not enough for many people, so there's a big kind of retreat into fantasy and RPGs and cosplay. And then dark cosplay is like consciously using dressing up as for dark political ends.
They want
That's
to
what I
appear
call
like
it.
they're on the front line, basically. I suppose that they're kind of one of the people and kind of not disassociated from all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think there's within these podcasts we give so many good suggestions for reading. I think you should always kind of read both sides of the equation, understand both sides of the equation before you make kind of any judgment on moving forward. And we'll put a lot of these links down below, but also we're going to put some like must reads on our website as well, which you can see down below as well. But it's a fascinating subject, and we could just talk for hours on this, which we're going to do over some of that thing. And I think we'll probably interweave some of this stuff in future episodes.
Yeah, well, there's some themes, right, that are coming in and out of what we're talking about, and I'm looking forward to exploring them further, Simon.
Most definitely. Please leave any comments down below, and please click subscribe and like. It does help the channel, and we want to bring on other people as well to sort of kind of talk through some of these things as well, so all that stuff will help. Thanks again, Ben.